We'd like to thank OraSure Technologies for hosting today's webinar presentation entitled Safety First, Rapid Oral Fluid Testing in the Construction Industry. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy to administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for 9 drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, methamphetamines, barbiturates, benzodiazepine, methadone, and opiates. Intercept is fast and easy to administer and is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, clinical setting screening programs, and more. Today's presentation qualifies for continuing education from SHRM, CCDAP, HRCI, and for those of you who are interested in receiving these credits, please note that you do need to attend the entire 1-hour presentation to qualify, and we will send you information after today's presentation on how to receive that credit information. Today's presenters are Judy Swartley from Red Planet Substance Abuse Testing and Jackie Perrone from OraSure Technologies. Judy Swartley is the president and founder of Red Planet Substance Abuse Testing. They specialize in Intercept lab-based saliva drug testing. They have customers throughout the country and in many different industries. And if you'd like to follow Judy on LinkedIn, she posts frequently on information that helps people stay up to date with topics on drug testing and safety. Also with us today is Jackie Perrone from OraSure Technologies. Jackie is the program lead for OraSure's Risk Assessment Division, and she has 25 years of experience in the drug testing industry. She's responsible for global direction as well as the financial and market growth of the drugs of abuse and risk assessment product lines. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the microphone over to Jackie first to get us started.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Very much appreciated. And both Judy and I are very excited to be able to talk with you for a little bit this afternoon about oral fluid drug testing, rapid testing, and how it kind of fits in with a couple of different industries, but specifically we're going to be talking about the construction industry today. And so you'll see on the agenda, we're going to talk through rapid oral fluid testing just sort of as an overview. We'll touch on adulteration. We'll also look at the construction industry in and of itself and how rapid testing kind of fits in there, and really how lab-based and rapid kind of can fit together with each other. And then lastly, we'll cover a few slides on safeguarding your workplace through drug testing. We will also touch a little bit on COVID and just kind of where we are as things are progressing with COVID and how oral fluid testing may actually kind of help from a COVID perspective. Okay, so we're going to start and talk a little bit about just oral fluid in general. And so from an oral fluid perspective, one of the things that we think about with oral fluid is the ease of use from a collection perspective. Collections can really occur anytime, anywhere. When you think about some of the other types of drug testing methodologies that are out there, let's say urine as an example, clearly you need some restroom facilities, and that is not essentially the case with oral fluid. It's a very easy process where a collection device goes into the person's mouth, and that can be observed. It doesn't take any special equipment or facilities to do that. Customizable panels. This is very similar to urine testing and hair testing as well, where you can actually mix and match different drugs that you want to test for. So you can have a very small panel, maybe 2 or 3 drugs, like maybe marijuana, cocaine, opiates, or you can have a very large panel that could be upwards of 12 or 14 different drugs. Jessica listed a few of the drugs that OraSure detects just a minute or so ago, and anywhere in between. And so depending on whether you're looking at a rapid test or a laboratory-based test, and we'll talk about that a little bit further, there is some a little more flexibility sometimes with a laboratory-based test as compared to a rapid test, and we'll get into the discussion on why, but there's many different panels that can be customized, so it's not a one-size-fits-all. Oral fluid testing actually has fairly high positivity rates, especially as compared to urine. If any of you are familiar with the Quest Drug Testing Index that comes out every 6 months, they actually do compare different testing methodologies. So they'll look at urine positivity rates, oral fluid, and hair. And what you typically see is hair and oral fluid tend to have much higher positivity rates than urine. Sometimes, depending on the drug, as much as 2 or 3 times higher positivity rates. And there's a number of different reasons for that. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get in. Oral fluid is nearly impossible to adulterate, and Judy is going to talk about this. There's a whole section on this, and she'll kind of go into a lot more detail as to why. Non-invasive, this, again, you're handing someone a collection device, they're swabbing the inside of their mouth. One of the nice things about oral fluid is it's a very employee-driven or donor-driven process where the collector, in many cases, can just be observing what's going on, the actual swabbing of the mouth and, putting the device into the chain of custody with the chain of custody seal and into the lab bag is actually done by the employee or the donor. So you're not having to worry about, observing anyone urinate into a cup or, getting very close to somebody taking a snip of hair. There's a variety of collection options. You can certainly collect on site. But we also know that people do use collection sites, and telehealth has become pretty big now, especially with the COVID pandemic we've had, where we've seen some collection locations with reduced hours or not be open nearly as long. So telehealth is another option, and it's a great option also to look at an oral fluid sample. One thing that we want to stress is make sure that you review state laws regarding oral fluid testing. Just as with urine, there are some voluntary and mandatory restrictions. That is the same with oral fluid, and so that's something the folks here at OraSure can help you with, CCG can help you with, your TPA can help you with. But very important to review the laws because there are some differences between urine and oral fluid testing and hair testing, and also differences between laboratory-based and rapid testing. When we talk about rapid testing, we hear lots of different names for it. And so I've kind of put on this slide here, you may hear rapid testing referred to as instant testing, point of collection testing, point of care testing, POCT, or on-site testing. It all means the same thing. Basically, and we're going to go through that, kind of what a rapid testing device looks like in the next slide or two, but it essentially is the opposite of laboratory-based testing. You get a result right then and there, and you see that result right on the device instead of having to send the sample to a laboratory. So, we wanted to kind of put this out here for you because some people refer to it differently, but it all means the same thing. Rapid testing, instant testing, it's all the same thing. So when you think about rapid testing, so we kind of put an example here for you. I had mentioned from an oral fluid perspective, there's usually, and this is one example, there are many different kinds of rapid tests out there. There's a number of different manufacturers. This particular version is very similar to several other versions that are out in the market. So this will give you a pretty good idea of how a rapid test is used and what it looks like. But essentially you're collecting the sample in the mouth, and typically that's a swab in the mouth for 30 seconds or so, maybe a little bit longer. You'll see there's like a cotton swab on the end, and you want that to be saturated. And then that wand actually is inserted into the device itself, and then you read the results. And you can see here on the results, 2 things that I want to point out. The first is that C, that's your control line. And what that means, because you're actually looking at the results here, so you want to make sure that the test is run correctly. So you'll notice that under the cocaine strip, you do not see a line there. You always, when you have a control feature in your product, and that's something you want to make sure if you're looking at rapid testing, that you have a control line, because that tells you whether the test has run correctly. So you'll see here where it says invalid under cocaine, there's no line there. That means for whatever reason, that test did not develop properly, and you can't look at that result as a valid result. You'll need to repeat it. The T stands for test line. And like a simple pregnancy test, there's either a line or no line. So in this particular case, you're looking for a positive result, or what we call presumptive positive, because you haven't confirmed it yet, is the absence of a line. So under PCP, you'll see no line there. And that basically means that's a presumptive positive. You'll also notice that we show negative, and so methamphetamine and opiates kind of right there in the middle where you see negative. You'll see those lines are actually a different intensity. So the methamphetamine line is a little bit darker than the opiates line. One of the golden rules with point of care testing, rapid instant testing, is you can't really make any determination of how positive the person is or not by how strong the line or dark the line is or not. So these are both considered negative results. Because one is a little bit lighter than the other doesn't mean anything. They're both negative, and you should not read anything into that. It's one of the most important things we tell people. So as you're looking at this, if you looked at this person would be positive for PCP, and they'd be negative for everything. This slide goes into just a little bit more detail about the device itself. And so this particular product, you'll notice on the wand, if you will, the collection swab, or what we call, some people will call it a wand or a stick. You see the sponge at the very end. That's the portion that goes into the person's mouth. When you take it out of the package, it tends to be a little bit stiff. And then as it goes into the person's mouth and the saliva saturates it, it becomes a lot more pliable, if you will, squishy and pliable. You'll see that it has the strip, a saturation indicator strip there, and an indicator window. That's important because what that's going to tell you is that enough saliva has been collected. So you'll see a color change there, and that indicates that you can withdraw the collection swab from the mouth. And then, as you noticed in the picture before, this whole swab goes into, it gets locked into the actual device itself. And as you'll see here where it says locking handle, as you twist and lock down, what happens is it actually compresses the sponge, and that allows for the saliva to actually come off the sponge and start wicking up each of these strips. And if you recall from the slide before, that's where you'll see your test line and your control line. So what's happening there is your saliva is actually wicking up the strip. It's reacting with the chemicals in the strip itself to give you the reaction or the result. And then you'll notice here on the right-hand side, some devices actually have an app for ease of use. And so this particular product, you can download an app, and that app will actually essentially take a picture just as you see there. And this particular product is called O-Scan. And it actually scans in and then sends an electronic record down to the employer or the TPA or the MRO, however you want it set up, to show that the results have been loaded and they are negative or positive. Real quickly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about marijuana and oral fluid testing. You know, we as you know, the United States, we're becoming more and more prone to legalizing marijuana. And so we get a lot of questions from people about, should I still test for marijuana? You know, how do some of these products work with marijuana? You know, do they pick it up or do they not pick it up? And quite honestly, there is a little bit of a difference between laboratory-based and rapid or instant results and testing as it really compares to primarily marijuana. Because marijuana is a fat-soluble drug, it can stay in the body for a little bit longer than many other drugs can, especially if you're using a urine test. And I think probably a lot of people have heard about, oh my gosh, you know, I tested positive up to 2 weeks or 3 weeks after I had my last dose or ingestion of marijuana. And that can be an issue with a urine test. it typically is not an issue with an oral fluid test. And that's because when you think about the window of detection, oral fluid mirrors blood. And essentially what that means is, and breath as well in many circumstances, very, very much initially, once you've ingested the drug, it actually is going to show up in your oral fluid, much like it would show up in blood. So within a few minutes, you're actually going to see a positive result if you have ingested marijuana. With urine, typically what happens with marijuana and with many of the other drugs, it has to metabolize through your system. So it takes several hours before you see a positive result. So there's this front end window where you're actually detecting many of the drugs with oral fluid sooner than you would for urine. On the back side of that, urine actually will hold many of these drugs longer in many cases than blood or oral fluid. So you actually do pick up some additional positivity rates on kind of the back end of it. But where this becomes really important is with marijuana, because marijuana is now legal. And what you don't want to do is essentially look at somebody and say, well, if you smoked on your own time over the weekend and 2 days later I've given you a test for marijuana, or the next day I've given you a test for marijuana, there's a very good likelihood if you use a urine test that they are still going to be positive. But because the window of detection is much shorter with oral fluid as it is with blood and breath, you will know whether that person has recently ingested. So it's a very good indicator that somebody is or could be under the influence. And that's really important. And Judy will talk a little more about this, but in the construction industry where, you know, you're working, you know, on these job sites, and maybe you're high up in the air and no pun intended, but you're on a scaffolding up in the air. You come down for a lunch break, you know, you maybe go out to your car, smoke some marijuana, ingest some marijuana, you come back up and there's an accident, and, you know, could marijuana be playing you know, a role in that? So that's where the window of detection comes in. Additionally, there's one other thing to think about, and that's really the difference between a marijuana test for a rapid test and a laboratory-based test. And that's kind of where cutoff levels come in. And you'll see here we say cutoff levels vary not only between rapid and lab, but also between manufacturers, and that is very true. So let's look at rapid and lab first. Laboratory-based tests, and there are a number of manufacturers that make laboratory-based tests, typically have a fairly low cutoff level for marijuana, usually somewhere between 3 and 4 nanograms, and that's a pretty low number. When you look at rapid tests, many of the rapid tests actually have a much higher cutoff level for marijuana. In many cases, it could be 30, 40, 50 nanograms. So it's a magnitude of levels higher. And what that means is the higher the cutoff level, in many cases, the shorter that window of detection. So the rule typically is you're going to get a little bit longer window of detection with a laboratory-based test than you will with a rapid test. And it's just something to be aware of as you're, you know, if you're looking at rapid testing. Compare package inserts, take a look at that, and ask your manufacturer, your sales rep, what's the window of detection for marijuana? Because it's important to understand, is it 3 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours? It's going to vary depending on what that cutoff level is. And then also between manufacturers, very important. If you look at 3 different rapid tests, you may have 3 different cutoff levels. One might be 30, one might be 50, one might be 100. And that is going to correlate to a varying time frame of how long you would actually be able to detect marijuana. Now, it's a little bit confusing, and that's certainly something that, you know, your sales representative can kind of help weed through. But it is very important to understand that there are some differences in windows of detection, and just to be aware of that and understand what works best for you in your particular situation that you want to be testing. One last thing as it comes to tests, and that's FDA clearance. So for workplace testing, you want to really look for an FDA cleared test. And that's because from a workplace perspective, the FDA really prefers to have an FDA cleared product, and there are some that are prescription only, which are also cleared by the FDA, and others that are what's considered forensic use only, which is not really cleared from an FDA perspective. So again, for your workplace, it's really important, it's really most important to you is FDA clearance something that matters and is important, and that's something you want to make sure that you're taking a look at as well. Okay, so just a couple of key differences. So rapid, and we've touched on a lot of all this, so this will go pretty quickly. Rapid oral fluid testing, you're going to get results very quickly. I may not have touched on it, but the results typically within minutes, usually 5 to 10 minutes, somewhere in that range. Some of them could be a little bit longer, 12 to 15 minutes or so, but there's a big difference between that and laboratory-based testing, just because the sample needs to be sent to the lab needs to test it, and then they need to validate the results. So typically your laboratory-based results are 24 to 72 hours. More often closer to the 24-hour side with a negative result, but a little bit longer for a positive result. So that's a big difference between the two. Generally, rapid testing is kind of a human visible, you're looking at it. Even that app that I showed you isn't necessarily reading the result, they're just recording that result. So there are some point of care products, rapid testing products that actually have an instrument read to it. But most of what we see in the drug testing world is still that visual human read. From a laboratory perspective, you've got an instrument that's actually doing the reading. Rapid testing is really great for initial screening. It's really meant to weed out your negatives. There's far more negatives than positives out there, and it's really best to get people, you get them on the job, get them working, keep them working. You can screen them out. And Judy will talk a little bit more about this, but we always recommend, if you've got a presumptive positive, that result is sent into the lab, or at least confirm with a secondary method to make sure that it is a true reading. The lab will do the initial and the confirmation at the same time, essentially. FDA clearance, as you look, many of the point of care products, at least for oral fluid, are going to be more along that forensic use only. There are a few that are FDA cleared or allowed for what they call prescription use, but it's a relatively new area, really within the last couple of years, versus laboratory-based testing has, for oral fluids anyway, has been around for more than 20 years. And so there's a long history to draw from. Most all the products, in fact, every product that, for the most part out there, has some FDA clearance with it. Cutoff levels are going to vary with both products, and both have very simple collections. And again, caution that state law, we really need to take a look at state law, especially as you're looking at rapid testing. Okay, so what is a rapid oral fluid test best suited for? So companies that are concerned about marijuana impairment, it's a really good way to look at kind of the shorter window, especially from a marijuana perspective. So a rapid test is really good for that, based on where the cutoff levels of many rapid tests are. For programs that test regularly, because really what you're being able to do here is get people in and out very quickly. You get the result within a few minutes, and so it's a great test from a routine perspective. You're not having to wait that time at the laboratory. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these, but it is very good for post-accident testing, especially to rule in or out whether drugs may or may not have been involved. Pre-access, random, and reasonable suspicion testing as well. So it fits within all of these, and Judy's going to take a little bit more time to walk you through a few examples of some of these in a little bit more detail. Judy, if you want to take it over from here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks to OraSure and Current Consulting Group for the opportunity to be a part of this presentation. All right, what is the right sample type? Let's take a look at urine versus saliva. So oral fluid positivity rates are consistently higher than other testing methods. Recent reports found that urine positivity rates at 4.5%, whereas the oral fluid is at 10.5%. That's a huge difference in the positivity rate. Reports also found that urine positivity rates dropped from almost 14% in 1988 to a mere 4.5% in 2019. So, a lot of times when I'm out with companies and we talk about things like this, um, when they tell me what their positive rate is, some of them tell me their positive rate is 1% or 2%. They always attribute it to the fact that they're doing a great job with their drug testing program. And as we will see in the upcoming slides, that's not necessarily the case. So, synthetic urine. How does urine test subversion happen? We're going to look at a little bit more of the details, but I just wanted you to see what a bottle of synthetic urine looks like. A lot of people have heard about it, but a lot of people have never seen a bottle. And it's maybe about 3 by 5 inches, maybe the size of an index card or a piece of paper like that size. And then also we have the hand warmer next to it. And you'll notice at the bottom of the bottle, there's a temperature gauge so that people can tell the temperature of this synthetic urine. And why they made it yellow, I don't know, but they just wanted to make it look as much like the real deal as possible. So synthetic urine, we're finding that it's the most popular way to treat a urine drug test. And the reason I felt it was so important for you to see what that bottle looked like is because I've had collectors tell me at the end of a day of collecting urine drug tests that the trash cans were filled with these small bottles. And that's exactly what was happening. People were using the synthetic urine to cheat the drug test. And most synthetic urine will definitely beat a drug test. Some labs can detect it, but honestly, there are always ways of getting around that. Now, how do people use it? Well, basically what they do is they put that bottle of synthetic urine in the microwave, get it heated up. They heat up the hand warmers, and by the way, you can purchase those at drugstores, at sporting stores, wherever. So they heat both the hand warmer and the small bottle in the microwave, get it to a certain temperature, and then they wrap it in some kind of insulation, because what they're going to do is to strap it onto their arms, legs, or belly. The reason they do that is because the collection centers can only ask people to empty their pockets. They can't pat the person down. So obviously you're not going to put this stuff in your pocket. You're going to have to tie it to your body. The average price is only about $40, maybe $45. So it's a really cheap way of assuring that you'll pass your drug test and you'll also keep your job. Now, at this point, when I'm talking to people, they'll say, oh, I don't have to worry about that because I have observed collections. Well, observed collections are effective, but it depends on the person doing the observing. And there are prosthetic devices available. They're available for men and women. They come in a variety of color. And the way these things work is that it's a special pair of underpants that has a pocket for a bottle of synthetic urine, and it's connected to the prosthetic device by a plastic tube, and the person practices, gets this down straight, and when they go in there for the observed sample, it's really pretty convincing. So, what to do if you're using the instant saliva drug test and you get what's called a presumptive positive? Keep in mind that instant oral fluid is a screening test. It's very important. It's just the first level. It's a screening test. On the other hand, the lab-based saliva test is both a screening and a confirmation test. What we don't want you to do is to send the employee to a collection center for a urine confirmation test. we'll get back to this example, but the reason is that some drug users actually strap this bottle of synthetic urine on themselves every day before going to work. It's almost like putting on a pair of socks and now I'm going to put on my synthetic urine. This way, if there's an accident or if there's any other reason for a drug test, they'll always pass a urine confirmation test. So for them, it doesn't matter if you're doing saliva or urine screening tests, because if you do the confirmation test with urine, they can always pass it. And there's always that small chance that somebody will not cheat, will not use the synthetic urine, and they will pass the urine test, but it's not very likely. So the example I wanted to talk about was we had a rather large contractor outside of the Washington area, and they had a safety director who was really forward thinking, and they wanted to do the best kind of tests possible. So for them, that meant using the instant saliva drug test for people that were getting onto the job and for new people. But then for the follow-ups, for the confirmation test, they would use the lab-based saliva drug test. And it was working perfectly. Instant saliva and then lab-based saliva. So the program was smooth. Their positive rate was usually around 5%, which is really pretty low for the construction industry, but they were doing really well. They got a new safety director, and the new safety director didn't want to learn about saliva testing. So he said, look, we're going to keep the instant saliva for pre-employment, but if anybody needs a confirmation test, we're just going to get a urine confirmation test. After a year and a half, I asked them what their confirmation rate was. He said, believe it or not, we haven't had a single positive. And he was proud of that. He said, this just proves that we have such a great company. But really what it proved was there was a lot of cheating going on. And their company was becoming a haven for drug users because they knew they could get a job with this excellent company and still keep their job, still continue doing drugs. So how does oral fluid testing eliminate subversion or cheating? Basically, it's observed without privacy concerns. Sample is taken from the mouth. And right here, I do want to mention the fact that you do have to wait 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes before before testing with saliva. The reason for that is that saliva regenerates in the mouth every 10 minutes, and you want a fresh batch of saliva. Next, we don't have to worry about any shy bladder, dilute specimen, or the just use the bathroom excuses. And lastly, there's really no opportunity to use a synthetic sample or an additive. So now let's take a closer look at the construction industry and using rapid oral fluid testing. So really the advantages in the construction industry are definitely great advantages. They're huge advantages. Most importantly is that you can do either the instant or the lab-based test any place, anytime. And it's excellent for second and third shift. Have you ever had an accident 10 minutes before the end of the first shift? Try to find an open collection center after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then if you do, they want to charge you $300 for the test. It's really absurd. Whereas with the rapid test and with the lab-based test, it's the same price 24/7. You can do the test anytime. It eliminates delays in results due to collection errors, redoing unfit for testing samples, and adulteration issues. No need for an off-site facility or even an on-site porta potty. Reduces employee lost work time. That's a big thing because some contractors get they get reimbursed for time if they come in before the deadline on the job. Reduce time to hire. And oral fluid is excellent during the pandemic. For example, it is so easy to have a 6-foot folding table, have the administrator at one end, have the donor at the other end, and maintain social distancing. The reason that is so easy is because the administrator only gives directions. It's the donor that gives all the that does all the work. So you have that. You don't have to worry about unsanitary bathrooms. When was the last time the bathroom was cleaned? You don't have to worry about scheduling hassles, and you don't have to worry about collection facilities. As Jackie mentioned, a lot of collection facilities now are closed because they don't have the staffing to keep sanitizing them. So that has been a really big headache. And the other thing about either the instant or the lab-based saliva drug testing, the advantages to the construction industry is that once you get the hang of them, you can do more than one at the same time. So if you're doing a hiring fair, or if you're trying to get people on the job site that day, it's pretty easy to do 3 people at the same time. So within 15 minutes, you're getting 3 people on the job, opposed to doing a urine test, either on site with a porta potty or sending them out. You're looking to test 3 people, you're looking at probably at least an hour, if not several hours. Trends. So this is the trend that we're seeing with the construction industry. As Jackie mentioned, you can use either product for all the types of testing: pre-employment, random, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, etc. But the trend that we're seeing with construction is that they have to hire people on the spot. If they can't hire people on the spot, that employee or potential employee is just going to go down the road to the next job site and get a job. So it seems that for the pre-employment, the instant saliva drug test is the way that things are going. Now, most companies still want to use the lab-based oral fluid testing for post-accident and reasonable suspicion because it is both a screening and a confirmation test. The other reason is that for post-accident testing, when you use the lab-based saliva test, it's once and done. You put one thing in the mouth, they pack it up, it gets sent to the lab. You don't have to do 2 tests. So that's the important thing and the trends that we're seeing. Rapid oral fluid tests. It saves money, and that's a good thing. Fewer workplace accidents, reduced liability, lost work time is down to a minimum, gets employees on the job faster, sample collection incurs no extra costs. Time and costs are saved by eliminating retesting due to collection error, diluted samples, samples out of temperature range, and adulteration issues, etc. So the bottom line is that when you think about it, you know, your saliva detects more positives. So through those more positives, you eliminate drug users from your workforce. And by eliminating the drug users, you're usually starting to decrease on accidents on the job. So when the accidents start decreasing, the MOD ratio starts decreasing and your workers' comp premium starts decreasing. So it's just a really great thing that can help you with the business end. Lastly, let's take a look at an example. So Alexandra runs a construction site with a lot of employees. And in order to perpetuate a drug-free workplace culture, she's decided to implement a pre-access testing program where employees must receive a negative test result before entering the workplace for each shift. So she wants to make sure that employees every day before they enter the test are before the work site are tested. And she's wondering, what kind of testing should I use? Well, this is probably the most clean-cut reason to use an instant saliva drug test. She has to get the employees on the job before they can start working. She doesn't want to delay the start of it. She can't really afford to wait time for getting a result. So she needs an instant test, and the instant saliva test has so many advantages over the urine test. It's virtually impossible to cheat and gives very good results. And I kind of like to have this flip in the way we're thinking. Normally, we're thinking about getting the most positives. Well, here, what you really need to think about is getting the most negatives so you can get the people into the job site. So we've talked back there on a few slides back about the positive rates. And basically, if you want to think about it, about 90 to 96% of the people are going to be negative. And that's what you want to get to as soon as possible. So you want to do the testing, you want to do it quickly, you want to find out who the negatives are and get them on the job. And again, all non-negative rapid results must be followed up with lab-based oral fluid testing. All right, don't send people out for a confirmation test with urine. Follow it up with a lab-based oral test. If using lab-based oral fluid testing, follow-up can be done on site the same day. It doesn't take any new precautions. The supervisor or whoever's doing the testing would simply whip out a lab-based fluid test, put it in the person's mouth, well, give directions to the person. They should put it in their mouth. They run through the test, and then it'll get sent off to the laboratory, overnight it to the lab, and they'll get the results in 24 to 72 hours. Now notice, we're saying 72 hours. That's if they'll get the negative results in 24 hours, but if the test has to go on to an MRO or medical review officer, that's where it'll take at least an extra day. And legally, the MRO has up to 3 days to get to contact your employee. And that's it. Back to Jackie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Judy. So I'll finish up with a couple of slides, and then we should have a few minutes for some Q&A. I do see a couple of questions have come in, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. So really kind of safeguarding your workplace through drug testing. And really this whole section applies to the fact that we shouldn't not think about drug testing. There are a lot of reasons to continue drug testing. One of the things that we've seen in this past year is that drug testing during a pandemic and as people are coming back to work is going to be more important than ever, because so many Americans have reported starting or increasing substance abuse as a way of coping with stress and emotions related to COVID. When you think about, just some of the things going on, whether it's just from the pandemic itself, am I going to get the virus? How bad is it going to be? Economic stress. I've lost work hours. I've lost my job. My spouse has lost my job. And just general anxiety are all a major driver for these increases. And we've seen overdoses spike since the onset of the pandemic. Specifically, we're seeing a lot of opiates being abused, and believe it or not, amphetamine and methamphetamine as well. And when you think about, things that people like to do that are outlets for them, physical activity, social interactions, obviously we've not been able to do that in the way that we used to be able to do that. And so when you think about like how then to get your emotions in check, a lot of people have turned to drugs and unfortunately alcohol as well. When you look at the types of workers that have reported a substance abuse disorder in the past year, and so this really looks at the percentages out there, and you see construction workers at 14%, followed very closely behind mining and utility workers, along with manufacturing. So all of these industries are prone to a higher level of substance abuse to begin with, and then kind of, add in the pandemic on top of that. And that, those are reasons why we want to continue thinking about drug testing and thinking about, if there's an accident, could possibly something have been, drugs or alcohol have been, a part of the reason for that accident. Construction workers are also the most likely of any industry to use cocaine and misuse prescription opioids, as well as being the second most likely to use marijuana, according to a study by New York University. And if you remember just what I said a few minutes ago, one of the highest ranking, if you will, drug that's being abused during the pandemic is opioids. So I talked a lot about marijuana and testing for marijuana before, but there are also very good reasons to be looking for other drugs, if you suspect that somebody could possibly be under the influence or using or have an issue. And I think this will be our last slide. So very similar to the slide that Judy had, here's a situation and kind of what's the best drug test for that specific situation. So Alfonso's a worker in the warehouse at a heating and air conditioning company. He comes back from lunch, gets in his forklift, promptly drives it into a wall, and he drops a box on another employee's foot in the process. And so what should the company be doing as far as testing? And so when you think about accidents, some of the things that our customers have told us really depends on the accident in and of itself as to whether you would, perhaps use a rapid test or you would use a laboratory-based test. And the way that a lot of people look at this is, if this is sort of a minor injury or a minor accident, there's no doctor's visits, you don't think there's going to be any legal issues with it, rapid testing is probably the best practice there. Speed to result is essential, as it allows the employees to return back to work as soon as possible, right? So, you test the employee, negative, okay, you can return them safely back to work. On the other hand, if there are injuries that require doctor's visits or there's a larger amount of property damage, a lot of our customers tend to go with laboratory-based testing as a best practice. And that's because of the legality here. Injuries requiring insurance claims, property damage. The nice thing about a laboratory test is you're automatically going to get that confirmation test done. And that really is, it's from a laboratory perspective, you're probably in a better place if you think there's going to be any possible legal actions that would come out of this. And so you make sure to define what constitutes rapid or lab-based post-accident in your policy. And that's one of the things we haven't touched on too much today is make sure your policies are up to date. A lot of folks probably have not thought about rapid testing. If that's something that you want to take a look at and try, really taking a look at your policy, understanding what changes need to be made, and that's something that Judy can absolutely help you with. As part of her service, she will look at policies and make recommendations. But that absolutely, if you change the way that you're testing, you want to make sure that you've also changed your policies and procedures to mirror it, and that's a really important thing to be thinking of. And I think with that, I do believe that is our last slide. So we've got a few minutes left here for some questions. So I'm going to turn this back to Jessica, and she'll guide us through whatever questions came in.
Thank you so much, Jackie and Judy, of course, for all of that wonderful information. As we get some of these questions out, I just wanted to remind those of you on the call with us today about our continuing education credits. You will get an email with the information for those credits that'll be sent out to anyone who's qualified by attending the 1-hour presentation. We want to thank OraSure Technologies for hosting this webinar. If you have any questions that we haven't answered yet, please go ahead and submit them into the question section. Earlier in the presentation, Jackie talked about making sure that you're aware of the state guidelines as they apply to oral fluid. And so just so you know, there is a handout today that you can download if you're interested in that information. We'll also send it to you in the follow-up email with a link to it. So if you don't want to download it now, you don't have to, but if you're interested in that information, of course, please feel free to download it. And with that, we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of questions and answers. Let's start out with this first question that we have. It says, I heard that SAMHSA issued guidelines for oral fluid testing. Can I use those guidelines for my drug testing program even though my company is not federally mandated to drug test? And I'm going to send that one over to Jackie.
Absolutely, Jessica. Yeah, there's no reason. We've actually heard from a number of our workplace customers that they'd kind of been waiting for the government to signal the acceptance of oral fluid testing. And for those of you that may or may not be familiar, in October of 2019, the oral fluid mandatory guidelines were issued. And so what that does is it allows the federal segment of the population, so anyone that works for the federal government, to be able to use an oral fluid test. Up until that point in time, only urine testing was allowed. And so a lot of people talk about the oral fluid guidelines, and that's exactly what they talk about. Those guidelines will actually be transitioning, hopefully, over to the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, and the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They each have their own process for looking at guidelines and approving things, but they take their cue from what SAMHSA and the feds do. And so very soon, all of those folks will be able to use oral fluids, and they hadn't been before. Where this becomes interesting for the non-regulated workplace market, you know, we have, when you think about companies, there are some hybrid companies out there that, because they have commercial drivers with a CDL license, they have to follow those mandated guidelines, but they may also have other employees that don't necessarily fall under the mandated guidelines. And so there's sort of a hybrid. And then there's other companies that, like I said, they just kind of wanted to wait for the government to signal that they have approved oral fluid. They've looked at the science behind it. They feel it's as effective as urine testing. And they've kind of given it the thumbs up. So absolutely, if you are not a regulated industry, so in other words, you're not the federal government, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Defense, or the NRC, you can absolutely use oral fluid testing. There's no restrictions against you doing that. The only restriction, I know we've said it a couple of times, is there are some state laws that are a little bit different for oral fluid that you want to look out for. And as Jessica mentioned, there's a handout that you can easily look at your state and see if it's included.
Great, thank you so much, Jackie. This next question I'm going to send over to you, Judy, so you're ready to go. The question says, you mentioned that if a rapid drug test is positive, then we should send an oral fluid sample to a lab for confirmation. My question is, do we send the same oral fluid sample, or do we need a new sample? And second, can I send the sample to any lab for confirmation, or are there certain labs that specialize in oral fluid testing?
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Well, actually, there are certain labs that deal with oral fluid testing, and it has more to do with the way the sample is processed. But when you do a screening test with an instant saliva drug test, it depends on the test as to whether or not you can send that same test to a laboratory. However, what we really advise, because those tests are screening tests, they're not capable of being a confirmation test. So that's why we really tell people to learn how to use two tests, and one would be the instant test, one would be the lab-based test, and then you'll get the more accurate results. And yes, there is a chain of custody form that comes with that test. So it's very similar to what a urine chain of custody form would be, and that gets overnighted with the test swab to the laboratory. You don't have to worry about picking out a certain laboratory because that's part of the process about where it goes. And with that test, I might add there's enough saliva on that test so that if the person can test it, that it can go to another laboratory that can process urine, can process the lab-based saliva tests. And we can guide people through that to identify the proper laboratory for them. And that's about it.
Excellent. That's very helpful. That actually answered 2 questions that I had for you. So that was wonderful there that you touched on chain of custody as well. Let's go ahead and send another question. We've got a couple more minutes. Let's send another question over to Jackie. Is rapid oral fluid testing available for alcohol?
Yes, there are a number of companies. OraSure is one of them that actually has a rapid test for alcohol. We have a saliva test called QED, and it acts very, very similar to the oral tox that you saw a few slides ago, where there's a swab in the mouth, and then you place the collector onto kind of a little box, if you will. And this particular test is a quantitative test. It will tell you exactly how much alcohol is on board. So it's not a digital readout, but it will tell you 0.02, 0.04, 0.05. There are some tests out there that are saliva tests that will give you kind of a range. They're almost like a litmus test that you would use for pH in your pool or maybe your fish tank, and it'll give you a range, and it'll say like from 0 to 0.02, 0.2 to 0.4, or 0.4 to 0.8, and then anything higher than that. So there are a number of different tests that are out there. One of the things you want to take a look at, though, is whether they're FDA cleared, as we've talked about before, FDA cleared or FDA approved. CLIA is important, and also DOT. A number of these alcohol tests can be used for DOT testing as well.
Excellent. And can you tell us again, for one of our participants that missed it, the name of the alcohol oral fluid test?
So the one that OraSure has is called QED.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay. And with that, we're actually at the top of the hour, and we want to go ahead and wrap this up. If you did submit a question that wasn't answered in our little Q&A section right now, we will have a representative reach out to you to make sure that you get the answers that you're looking for. Again, we'd like to thank Jackie and Judy for their expertise and their time on this webinar presentation. On behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope that you found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording via email. We thank you for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar presentation.